So, yeah, it's a framing of the issue, but I don't think it's an incorrect, a misleading framing. I mean, in all problems, finding a way of looking at the problem so you can see it as its essence and you see the essence of an answer is the critical part of doing. So you find a way of looking at it, right? And then you'll look at other ways and see if there's some other way you say, oh, well, that way was misleading, I should go this way. I think this way of framing the issue of energy is the really useful one. And I'm not advocating this as just as a way to give talks and make people converse about this. I'm looking for the real true argument that might launch us in to flipping that switch and launching the biggest science program to solve the biggest problem. That's why I framed it this way. And so these audiences, after initially being struck that I was going to ask them a question in a couple of blank minutes, will start proposing problems to put on the list. And I type it into my PowerPoint and show that I can't spell even now. And after a while, the audience will get into it, and finally I'd say, okay, that's all. You only get 10 problems. And then I'd tell the audience, well, prior to this, I really had 3 hypotheses that I wanted to test with your answer. I'll tell you what they are. First one was that if you gather any group of people together now, particularly after 9/11, it'd be interesting whether this was true before 9/11, but now, the word energy will always appear on this list. And so far in my experience, I've done this with 14 independent audiences, and after that people knew I was going to talk about energy, so I can't do it anymore. And so far, every one of those audiences, sure enough, energy phrased one way or another is one of the first top problems that are suggested. My second hypothesis is no matter in what order that it was suggested, when we went down to 10, if you move it to the top of the list, and here I would show my ability in PowerPoint to move it up and show them. And you imagine that through some miracle now this problem has been just solved. You've solved the energy problem. So there's now abundant energy in whatever amounts you need available around the planet at low enough cost that not only the richest people on the planet, but all of the people on the planet can afford and develop. And we've solved the energy problem. It's clean. It's abundant. It's going to be there year and year after. I mean, can you even just imagine using the word solved for the word energy problem? If you give me that as a precondition, then my hypothesis is that you will find that at least 5 of the remaining 9 problems on the list now have a path to an answer that's acceptable. Whereas in the absence of solving the energy problem, it was difficult, if not impossible in those cases, to have imagined an answer. And so with these audiences, we would go through the list and the problems that they suggested, and one after another, and said, test that hypothesis. And I've found that generally this does work. And I have now given a summary of the sort of answers I've gotten. In fact, these 10 problems were suggested by those 14. On the top 7 were suggested by every one of them. The remaining 3 are set of a number of about 6 to 7 other questions, problems that were suggested. And I've ordered them here in the order of their immediacy of the effect of energy on the problems. It's interesting that what many people believe is the single most important problem of it isn't energy, water, bubbles right up to the top of the list. And let me just pick on that as an example. So water is a very brutal problem. I mean, either you've got it or you don't. If you don't have it, you can't pretend that you've got it. You've got to go get that water molecule, either from somebody else that's got the water or someplace far away. Luckily on our planet, there's plenty of water. In fact, we probably have more water than anything else, but it has salt in it, and it's often thousands of miles away from where we need it, and we need it in vast amounts, hundreds of millions of gallons a day. Well, we can take the salt out of the water. There's no doubt some neat little nano thing that will do it at 100% thermodynamic efficiency or close to it. Or you can just boil the water, but you can do it if you have the energy. Of course, you need a lot of low-cost energy to do this because you need hundreds of millions of gallons a day. And you've got to put it in pipe and pump it off to where you need it, which might be thousands of miles. Well, we can make pipes, and we know how to pump them. We know how to do that whole thing, but it costs energy to make them, it costs energy to maintain them, and energy to pump the water from here to there. But we can do it. If we have the energy, we can solve the water problem. I mean, just solve it for 10 billion people everywhere on the planet, even places that don't rain. But if you haven't got the energy, you can't solve the problem. There's just no way. So that's straightforward. The second one the third one is food, which is going to be an increasing problem on our planet. I mean, 1 billion people live a reasonable lifestyle on this planet. They're pretty much the group that consumes any energy to speak of. Right now, there's 6.5 billion people on the planet. So 5.5 billion hardly consume any energy at all. The bottom, roughly 2 billion, basically have no access to electricity at all. And this bottom, well, 5, 6, is where all the population growth is on the planet. Food is a big problem for the billions of people we have already, let alone where we're likely to go to. The good news on population is that the fertility rates have continued to drop, and if they continue to drop in the future as they are dropping now, we might very well peak out in worldwide population at maybe 7.5, 8 billion before the middle of the century. And a couple years ago you couldn't say that, but now the optimistic UN projection is that this population problem will actually resolve itself at a level of 8, maybe 9 billion people. If the current fertility rates stay unchanged, we'll have more like 12 to 13 billion people by the middle of the century. But anyway, that's, at minimum, you're talking 7 to 8 billion people, and we have to feed them. So how are we going to feed them? Enough, I mean, to eat as well as we do in the top billion. Well, you need agriculture, you need water. We got plenty of water on the East Coast these days, but around the rest of the world, it ain't true. So if you solve the water problem, you've gone a long way to solving the food problem. I realize you can't just grow food and water. You need fertilizers. Oh, you need energy for that. We need to have a structure where we harvest them and move them around. Oh, we need energy for that. If you've got energy, you can hack this problem. If you don't have energy, cheap, vast energy, I don't see how you can solve the problem. Environment, virtually every aspect of our problem with the environment has either directly to do with the way we generate energy, where we get it, how we mess up when we drop it someplace before we get it where we want to, or what happens when we generate it. Or it's a problem that we run into that we could clean up if we had the cheap energy. I don't know of any other single thing, if you care about the environment, that would have a bigger positive effect than to hack the energy problem in the sense of just solve it. I want an answer. I want a new oil. I want it to be cheap and abundant. Right? This is my Republican pro-growth, pro-energy side talking here. I don't know of anything else you could do for the environment that would be more effective than this. And for many of us, we perceive that the biggest single problem with this planet right now is the huge imbalance between the rich and the poor. There's probably a greater difference between the top incomes, the well-being of the top 300 to 500 people on this planet and the lower 1 billion than at any time in the entire history of the human race. I mean, even when the pharaohs lived, there probably wasn't that much difference between a slave in the fields. Did they have slaves? Yes, they had slaves. And the pharaoh, as there is now between me, I'm not one of those top 500, and the bottom 1 billion people. I mean, roughly 1.5 billion people live from day to day by going out and collecting cow dung and sticks, mostly women and children, bringing them home, cook the evening meal in this little hut, lungs being affected by all of this. They have no life. They're really not part of a real civilization yet because of that limit that they don't have access to cheap energy. Of course, there's another problem. They wouldn't know what to do with it if they had it. But you can't solve it unless you've got the energy there to begin with. I want to solve that problem. There is no single factor that determines the well-being, economic well-being of a society that's more direct than the cost and availability of their energy, low-cost energy. Oil was what drove us to the great economic well-being that we have around the planet, at least for the top billion of us. I want to solve that problem, enabling a solution, at least a vast easing of this huge imbalance between rich and poor. The problem is not, here's my Republican right-hand side thing talking, the problem is not the rich. The problem is not prosperity, it's poverty that's the problem. We need to find a way of bringing up billions of people to a reasonable lifestyle that each and every human being has a reasonable expectation of being able to fulfill. You know, the life force that's within them. And if we don't address these very prime issues on the top list, the underlying basis for worldwide social and military unrest continues. And it's hard for most of us to imagine that we'll ever get to a place without hacking these seemingly insolvable problems where terrorism and war don't continue to be as much of a part of our future, if not more, than in the past. You can go further on down the list, and for every one of these problems and ones I've left off the list, you can also launch strong arguments that energy would have a tremendous enabling effect on solving them. But perhaps I've already made my point well enough. Energy would have a tremendous impact if you could solve it. Make it cheap, make it abundant, find the new oil. A miracle from science and technology, physical sciences primarily, that enables this. Third hypothesis that I had was that no matter what you suggested as being items that deserve to be on this list of top 10, if you take something other than energy and move it to the top, that you will not find anywhere near the same cooperative effect in a positive sense on the other ones as energy did. Well, here, if there's an exception to that rule, and there's several that you could argue, the bottom one is a good exception, population. I mean, if you move that to the top of the list and you solve the population problem, then I think I'd probably agree many, if not most, of the other problems can be solved. But what level of population would it be that would enable you to solve the other problems? Well, probably at most it's 1 billion people. Well, what did you have in mind to do with the other 5.5 billion people on the planet? Interestingly, after these conversations, after these talks, when we sit around cocktails later, I'll ask people, well, what do you think? How do you think this is really going to work itself out? I mean, really, what do you think? And often, actually, with remarkable frequency, 30, 40% of the time, I hear, well, Dr. Smalley, I don't think population is going to be anywhere near what you think it is in the middle of the century. And I said, oh, really? Just tell me about that. And I said, oh, well, some disaster, AIDS, nuclear war, meteor hitting something, and we're going to have way less. And that's fascinating. And I say, do you realize that in our knowledge of humans on this planet, there has never been a time when worldwide population has dropped even by a factor of 2. I mean, the Black Death was worth maybe 30%, but that was just Europe. It wasn't the planet. We can look all the way back to Moses to the extent we know. There's never a time when it dropped to a factor of 2. A factor of 2 would not help this problem. We need a factor of 6. So if you're counting on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse to solve this problem, there's never any precedent for doing that. And I'm very interested that you even bring the topic up. I mean, what level of deep pessimism about the future does that mean? So I think that's part of the resonance of this issue. You know, it's a seemingly impossible problem to solve, so big that is the standard human emotion, a very frequently encountered emotion, is that helplessness, that some force greater than us is going to solve this problem for us. And I often joke, but it's true, it reminds me of when I was a youngster in a public high school in Kansas City back in the 50s in the duck and cover year. I hated going to school. I hate going to school now. I was terrible that I played hooky, I didn't want to do my homework, and I would literally go to sleep at night praying for thermonuclear war so I didn't have to show that I didn't do my homework. Now that's it's an immature response to a seemingly overwhelming problem. And so some other bigger force will take this away. I won't have to go to school. But in the real world, the sun does come up the next day. You do have to get up and go to school. In our world, 2050 is going to happen. There are going to be a minimum 7 billion people on the planet, more likely 8 to 10. And either you've made the planet livable and workable for most of God's children, or you haven't. And you have to live in that world. So I'm a guy. I do chemistry and physics. I make stuff. I do stuff. This is, excuse me for the sexist term, this is a guy thing. We're going to go get a techno fix. I don't know how to handle all the other problems, but we can fix that energy problem. If it's fixable, if it was somehow wired into the laws of physics and nature in the universe to allow us to do this, I think we ought to go out and do it now. At least remove that problem from the list. Excuse me for the sexist term. I've been through 3 divorces. I've gone through this whole thing. And there is a gene. It's the same one that clicks the channels. It's, we're going to go fix it. It's a guy thing.